Today, the world's attention is focused on Ukraine. Russian forces have carried out their largest air operation since the conflict began. Hundreds of drones and decoys took to the skies overnight. Missiles were also used, including the Iskander ballistic missile. The strikes hit key targets, including government buildings in Kyiv and energy infrastructure. The event has caused a huge stir and has become the main story of the past 24 hours. Before we continue our alarming analysis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new materials. Your support helps us stay independent and bring you truthful information. The main narrative begins with the scale of the latest strike coming as a shock even to longtime observers. According to military analysts, this was a complex operation using different types of weapons simultaneously. This was not just a show of force, but an attempt to change the strategic balance. On the night of September 8th to 9th, the Russian side deployed more than 800 unmanned aerial vehicles and special targets designed to confuse air defense systems. Along with them, missiles capable of hitting fortified targets appeared in the air. The main episode was the hit on one of the government buildings in Kyiv. The symbolism of this strike is obvious. It shows that even the center of the capital is not fully protected. The operation has caused a strong response from the world community. The Ukrainian leadership invited foreign diplomats and representatives of international organizations to see the consequences of the attack with their own eyes. Politicians and military experts note that this step was not only symbolic, but also designed to increase pressure on allies. Kyiv is seeking to speed up the delivery of air defense systems and ammunition. Meanwhile, voices are growing louder in the United States and Europe about the need to rethink aid to Ukraine. The Financial Times reports that deliveries of anti-aircraft systems and missiles have slowed after the Pentagon conducted an internal audit of military support. Production is done in batches, so there are pauses between shipments. This creates vulnerabilities that the Russian military is trying to exploit. The European Union has agreed to allocate some of its own reserves and sign new contracts, but the actual volumes have not yet covered the demand. The White House continues to declare support for Ukraine, but American officials are increasingly hinting that it is time for Europe to take on more responsibility. Against the backdrop of these events in Russia, President Vladimir Putin awarded a Medal for Courage to one of the country's top military leaders. This decision has caused a mixed reaction abroad, since the general is under an international criminal court warrant. For Moscow, however, it is a sign of internal consolidation and a signal to society that the country's leadership remains firm and confident. The historical context also plays an important role. Such strikes have always had not only military, but also political significance. During World War II, massive bombings often became a tool for pressuring the enemy and its allies. Today, we see the continuation of this logic in new forms. The Ukrainian authorities have emphasized that the country needs new defense technologies. This includes not only Patriot missiles and Stinger systems, but also more modern systems that can cope with combined attacks. Experts note that decoy drones are becoming a real challenge. Their main goal is not to cause direct damage, but to exhaust the air defense system, forcing it to spend valuable missiles on cheap targets. The night of September 8th thus became a turning point. It showed that the war was entering a new phase, where it would not only be tanks or infantry that would be decisive, but the ability to withstand airstrikes. And it is here that Ukraine faces its biggest challenge. To understand the scale of the operation and its significance, we need to go back a little and consider how the current situation was formed. In recent months, the Russian side has been steadily increasing the intensity of its air attacks. Both new types of drones and modernized missiles were used. Military experts say that the stockpiling of supplies was planned. The strikes were not spontaneous. They were the result of long preparations, which took into account the weak points of the Ukrainian air defense. According to Western media, including the Financial Times, Kyiv was unable to receive everything it needed in the required timeframes. Ammunition arrived in batches. There were pauses between deliveries. As a result, there was a deficit at certain times. It was precisely these windows that were used for the strike. The Ukrainian army faced a difficult dilemma. On the one hand, it had to protect the capital and major cities. On the other hand, it couldn't leave the front line, where heavy fighting was taking place, uncovered. Therefore, air defense systems were distributed in different directions, but they turned out to be insufficient. White House sources have said bluntly that it is time for Europe to take on more responsibility, in particular to stop buying oil from Russia and to devote more resources to military support for Ukraine. The statement sounded like a warning. Washington is willing to help, but it does not want to do everything alone. Against this backdrop, the European Union is discussing the idea of creating a so-called air shield over Ukrainian territory. The issue is about coordinating the supply of air defense systems that will be used to protect not only the fronts, but also large cities. There have already been articles in the British press about how this could be a faster and more practical option than sending ground troops. At the same time, Russia demonstrated its own plans. The media actively discussed the advances in the Sumy direction and the fighting in the Kharkov region. It was reported about the difficult situation of the 57th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which actually had only one combat-ready battalion left. On the southern borders, attention was drawn to the battles for the village of Primorskoye in the Zaporizhia direction. Representatives of the Russian side announced the expansion of the control zone. This news created a picture of gradual pressure on several sections of the front line at once. At the same time, the topic of foreign mercenaries became more active. The reports mentioned units consisting of Spanish-speaking fighters, as well as reports of the presence of Japanese and other foreigners. These facts were used by both sides for information work. Ukraine emphasized the international nature of its support. Russia, on the other hand, emphasized that representatives of different countries were participating in the conflict, and this strengthened its global dimension. Publications about the plans of Western countries played a special role. A map appeared on the internet, allegedly reflecting the plans of European countries to divide Ukrainian territories and control resources. Regardless of the authenticity of the document, it caused a heated discussion. The feeling has taken hold in the public consciousness that different scenarios for the future structure of the region are being prepared outside of Ukraine. The historical context adds drama. In the 20th century, similar maps were also drawn in closed offices. Back then, it was about spheres of influence and divisions of territories. Today, not only lands are at stake, but also resources, logistics routes, and strategic position. In this regard, Ukraine remains the center of intersection of interests. On the night of the strike, diplomatic activity increased significantly. President Volodymyr Zelensky made an address in which he emphasized that the country needed support more than ever. He said that if Ukraine retained its independence, it would be a victory, even if certain territories were temporarily occupied. Analysts took these words as a signal of a change in rhetoric. British expert Alexander Mercouris noted that such statements sound increasingly pessimistic. In his opinion, Zelensky is gradually preparing society for difficult decisions. He emphasized that for the first time, the Ukrainian leader has effectively abandoned his own peace plan, which he had previously put forward as a basis for negotiations. At the same time, opposite steps were being taken in Moscow. President Vladimir Putin reminded that the presence of NATO military forces on Ukrainian territory would be considered a direct threat. He also stated that if foreign troops did appear, they would become a legitimate target for strikes. This rhetoric clearly shows that Moscow is not prepared to put up with the expansion of the Western presence. The awarding of General Valery Gerasimov was another symbolic act. For the Russian audience, it is a sign of recognition of merit. For the Western public, it is a challenge and a demonstration of disregard for the decisions of international institutions. All this has created an atmosphere of growing tension. On the one hand, the largest airstrike, on the other, statements by leaders and the publication of materials that push the world to think that further escalation is inevitable. The night of September 8th became a test not only for the military, but also for politicians. The next stage of the conflict will depend on how they react. When we talk about the events of the last 24 hours, it is important to understand who exactly was involved in the operation and what goals the parties set. On the Russian side, the main emphasis was on the use of air assets. The scale of the attack was unprecedented. The operation involved drones of various types, including loitering munitions, as well as special decoys. Their task was to overload the enemy's air defense system. When operators wasted valuable missiles on cheap targets, more serious weapons came into play. This is how the strikes on targets in Kyiv were achieved. An important episode was the use of an Iskander ballistic missile. According to open sources, its target was in the area of the government quarter. The hit caused a strong resonance. For many, it became a signal that even the most guarded places cannot be considered completely safe. On the Ukrainian side, air defense crews were involved in the operation, working all night. Patriot, NASAMS, and IRIS-T systems were used. However, their number clearly did not correspond to the scale of the attack. According to official data, a significant number of drones and missiles were intercepted, but a breakthrough still occurred. At the same time, battles were taking place on the front line. In the Sumy region, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a series of counterattacks, trying to push Russian units back from the settlements of Yunakovka and Andreevka. These attempts, according to Russian sources, were repelled. Moreover, it is claimed that the Russian army was able to advance in the south of Yunakovka. In the Kharkov region, the situation around the city of Vovchansk attracted attention. Russian sources claim that the 57th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade of Ukraine has lost its combat capability. In fact, only one battalion remained in service. In the south, in the Zaporizhia region, Russian units entered the village of Primorskoye. Fighting there continues. This settlement is of strategic importance since it is located along the highway to Zaporizhia. We should not forget about the Dnepropetrovsk region. It was there, according to statements by Russian representatives, that strikes were carried out on positions of foreign mercenaries. In particular, they were talking about a unit of Spanish-speaking fighters. According to sources, most of the company was incapacitated after a series of airstrikes. Ukrainian officials have not yet commented on these episodes in detail. However, it is known that high levels of aviation activity were indeed recorded in various areas of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Another direction has emerged in the media space. An incident occurred in Kupiansk when units of the armed forces of Ukraine opened fire on their own reinforcements. According to preliminary data, a group of recruits found themselves under fire from their own due to confusion and lack of communication. This episode shows how difficult it is to maintain coordination in urban areas and under constant shelling. Moscow presented the operation as part of a strategy to put pressure on the enemy's military facilities and logistics. According to Russian officials, the main goal was to reduce the Ukrainian armed forces' potential for coordination and control. The reaction of the international community was immediate. Brussels expressed deep concern and promised to speed up the discussion of new sanctions against Russia. In the United States of America, a telephone conversation took place between the advisor to the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. The need for urgent supplies of air defense systems and ammunition was discussed. At the diplomatic level, they have again started talking about the possibility of deploying peacekeeping contingents. However, for now, this remains at the discussion level. European countries are not ready to take risks by sending their own ground forces. Against the backdrop of these events, the Ukrainian authorities decided to show foreign diplomats the destroyed buildings in Kyiv. This was a move designed to have an emotional impact. The delegation saw the aftermath of the strike with their own eyes. The footage was distributed throughout the world media. The night of September 8th turned out to be a real test for Ukrainian society. Videos appeared on social networks in which Kyiv residents heard the hum of flying drones. People hid in the subway and basements. In some areas, electricity was cut off to reduce the likelihood of damage to infrastructure. The situation at the front and in the rear has shown that the conflict continues to be extremely tense and unpredictable. Each new attack becomes not only a military but also an information event, around which political statements and diplomatic steps are built. The events of the last 24 hours clearly show that the conflict has entered a new phase. The large-scale airstrike and the retaliatory actions of the parties create the basis for serious changes in the dynamics of the fighting. Military analysts note that the use of more than 800 drones and decoys has become a record. Such tactics have a double meaning. First, it tests the strength of the air defense system. Second, it forces Ukraine's allies to speed up supplies and spend resources. This could lead to a situation where warehouses are empty at the most inopportune moment. The United States has already expressed concern. White House officials have said Europe must step up its commitment. American resources are limited, and domestic debates over the scale of aid to Ukraine are growing fiercer. Those in Congress are increasingly vocal in their demands to focus on their own national interests. European capitals, in turn, are facing political pressure from society. Rising energy prices and conflict fatigue are making the issue of military support increasingly contentious. However, it was after the latest strike that talk of an air shield in Brussels intensified. This means that the EU is ready to take more radical steps to prevent further destabilization. The scenarios for the development of events look alarming. The first scenario is the continuation of massive attacks from Russia. If such operations become regular, Ukraine will face the threat of exhaustion of the air defense system. This will create serious risks for the capital and major industrial centers. The second scenario is an intensification of diplomatic efforts. Showing the destroyed buildings to foreign diplomats could be a turning point. Kyiv hopes to provoke an emotional reaction and speed up the decision on additional supplies. If successful, Ukraine will receive new air defense systems and be able to temporarily stabilize the situation. A third scenario is the gradual inclusion of Western countries in more direct support. The idea of an air shield, discussed in the Financial Times, could become a reality. This would mean coordinating the supply of radars, anti-aircraft systems, and early warning systems. But even then, the question remains, who will take responsibility for managing them and deciding on their use? The fourth scenario is a further expansion of the front. Reports of fighting in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions indicate that the contact line may shift. For Ukraine, this means the need to transfer reserves. For Russia, it is a chance to increase pressure in several directions at once. Analysts stress that each scenario carries risks. Diplomatic efforts could stall if allies fail to reach an agreement. And direct Western involvement could increase tensions between Russia and NATO. At the international level, the reaction is already noticeable. The European Union is preparing the 19th package of sanctions against Russia. It may include measures against oil companies and their subsidiaries. However, the effectiveness of the sanctions remains debatable. The Russian economy has adapted to the restrictions, and new partners in Asia and the Middle East are compensating for the losses. At the same time, statements continue to be made in Moscow about the inadmissibility of the presence of foreign troops on Ukrainian territory. President Vladimir Putin has directly stated that any deployment will be considered a threat and will lead to retaliatory steps. These words create additional tension in diplomatic circles. Society in Ukraine itself is facing a new test. The subway and basements are once again becoming shelters. The energy infrastructure is overloaded. The country's economy continues to depend on external injections. The symbolic aspect should not be underestimated either. When foreign diplomats saw the destruction in Kyiv, it became a kind of metaphor. Before their eyes was a picture not only of a destroyed building, but also of the fragility of the international security system itself. Experts' forecasts differ. Some say that the situation will only worsen, and winter will be the decisive stage. Others believe that a window for negotiations is opening right now. However, the political will of the parties does not coincide. Kyiv demands guarantees of security and preservation of independence. Moscow insists on taking into account its own interests and preventing NATO presence. There is a chasm between these positions, and each new blow only widens it. We have reached the end of our alarming analysis. Over the past 24 hours, Ukraine and the entire world have witnessed events that are already being called turning points. A large-scale air operation involving hundreds of drones and missiles has shown that the war has entered a new phase. Now, not only ground battles are coming to the fore, but also the ability to withstand airstrikes. The consequences of the attack were felt not only by the residents of Kyiv. The strikes were heard along the entire front line. In the Sumy region, there were counter-battles. In the Zaporizhia region, clashes continued for the village of Primorskoye. In the Dnepropetrovsk region, aviation became more active, as evidenced by reports of the defeat of foreign units. Even in cities far from the front, people heard the sounds of sirens and explosions. That night left a vivid mark on the memory. For some, it was a confirmation of the determination to continue the fight. For others, it was a symbol of fragility and vulnerability. In any case, the world saw that the conflict was far from over. If we try to sum it up, we can highlight several key conclusions. First conclusion: Russia has shown that it is capable of coordinating complex operations using different means simultaneously. This means that similar attacks can be expected in the future. Second conclusion: Ukraine faces a serious shortage of air defense assets. Without additional supplies, the country risks being under constant threat of new strikes. Third conclusion: the international community faces a choice. Europe and the United States must decide whether they are ready to increase their support for Ukraine or limit themselves to statements. The balance of power in the coming months depends on this choice. Conclusion 4. Diplomatic activity is increasing, but the parties are still far from a compromise. Volodymyr Zelensky's statements that even partial preservation of independence can be considered a victory indicate a change in rhetoric. Vladimir Putin's statements about the inadmissibility of NATO's presence confirm that Moscow does not intend to retreat. Fifth conclusion: the conflict is increasingly becoming global. Foreign mercenaries are involved. There is talk of introducing peacekeeping forces. Maps and plans are appearing that hint at possible redistributions of territory. All this is turning the Ukrainian crisis into an arena for a clash of interests between the world's largest players. What happens next? We will likely see more air attacks. Ukraine will seek accelerated supplies of air defense systems. Europe and America will discuss new sanctions and support measures. Russia will seek to expand its zones of control on the front lines, and diplomatic negotiations will remain difficult and controversial. The world is on the threshold of a new winter. Historical experience shows that it is the cold months that are the most difficult. Ukraine's energy infrastructure has already taken a serious hit. If the attacks continue, the country will face the threat of blackouts, disruptions, and humanitarian hardship. At the same time, Western countries may try to speed up deliveries. If successful, Ukraine will gain a breathing space and an opportunity to strengthen its defenses. If the pauses in deliveries continue, vulnerabilities will only increase. Every day, every night, people live in anticipation of new attacks. Their fate depends on decisions made in offices in Washington, Brussels, and Moscow. And as long as these decisions remain contradictory, the war will continue. We will follow the developments. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay up to date with all the news. Your attention and support help us continue this work. New releases, new facts, new analyses are ahead. Stay with us to figure out what is happening together.